What is your biggest problem today? You may think it's a financial problem or a relational problem or even a vocational problem. But I would say to you that your greatest problem today is a spiritual problem. Stick around today as I talk about that. It happened August 16th, 1987. It was Northwest Airlines Flight 255. After it had taken off from the Detroit airport, the airplane experienced trouble and ultimately crashed on a highway just outside of Detroit. As a result of the crash, 155 people died, another 200 people were injured. When responders arrived on the scene, they found people that were injured, people that had perished in the plane crash. But then they came across 4-year-old Cecilia. When they came upon her, they found her just walking through the wreckage of the plane crash, and she was covered from head to toe in blood. The responders grabbed her, they started to treat her, and very quickly discovered that the blood that was on Cecilia was not her blood. And they just assumed that Cecilia was maybe a passenger in one of the cars that was on the highway that day. But after they checked the passenger manifest of the flight, they discovered that Cecilia was actually on the airplane with her mother, her father, and her brother. They were heading back to Tempe, Arizona from a vacation that they had just completed. And what they later on discovered was as the plane was heading for the crash, Cecilia's mother, Paula, unbuckled her seatbelt. She got down on her knees in front of Cecilia and just wrapped her body with her own. And when the plane crashed, it was Paula's body that experienced the trauma associated with the crash and ultimately died, but Cecilia walked away. And there she was covered from head to toe with someone else's blood. You and I, like Cecilia, we are on an airplane that is about ready to crash, and it's going to crash because of our sin. All of us have fallen short of God's standards. All of us have sinned, and all of us have tried to find ways to cover over our sins. And this goes way back to the beginning of time when Adam and Eve in the garden sinned against God. The first thing they did was they sewed leaves and put them on their bodies to try to hide their bodies. And there they then tried to literally hide from God in the garden so that they could just cover over their sin and their shame. And there are many religions in the world that offer a solution to the sin problem in the world. And many of the religions in the world, all the religions in the world, tell you and I that we have to do something, that you and I have to be a good person, or you and I have to do the right rituals, or you and I have to go to the right places in order for us to experience forgiveness of our sins. And Christianity does not just offer a solution to our sin problem. Christianity is about Jesus, who He Himself came to be the solution for our sin problem. You see, He came to do what you and I could never do. However, there are times in which you and I try to cover over this problem of sin. Many people, sometimes we try to minimize our sin. And I hear people all those times just saying, well, I just made a mistake. You see, a mistake is just literally not having the right information. And people say, I did something that was dumb. I was stupid when I did that, or I was just acting foolishly. I didn't know what I was doing. And they just try to minimize their sin and try to make it not as bad as it really is. Listen, you can minimize the reason why a plane is falling out of the sky, but ultimately it's going to crash. Some people try to just cover their sin by trying to justify it. The reason why I did that is because blank made me do it. And you can just, whatever you want to fill in the blank with. My spouse made me do it, or the way my kids are acting, that's what made me do it. Or, my boss who's just overbearing, that's what made me do it. Or the alcohol made me do it. And whatever you want to fill in the blank, and you can try to justify your sin. But in the same way, you can justify why a plane is going to crash, but it's not going to stop it from crashing. And there are still other times in which we just try to ignore our sin problem. If we don't think about it, if we just try to distract ourselves with entertainment and the things that this world has to offer, and try to distract ourselves with maybe a relationship or drugs and alcohol, that we just don't even have to think about it. And you can ignore that a plane is going to crash, but it's still going to crash. All of us have this sin problem that needs to be dealt with. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I started this series on the life of Moses a few weeks ago, and I've entitled it Experiencing God on the Journey. And we've seen in Moses' life the many ways in which he has experienced God in some new and profound ways in his life. We started the series and we saw at the beginning of the book of Exodus that God is always at work, and there we experience God in our lives, and he is up to something even when we see nothing. Then after that, we saw there as Moses approaches the burning bush and he encounters God for the first time in his life, and God asks him to do something that Moses just felt he was ill-equipped to handle. And there we learn that you and I can experience God's power even in the face of our greatest weaknesses. And I reminded you that day that our availability is more important than our ability. And last week we saw how Moses eventually he committed himself to going back to Egypt to speak to Pharaoh, and he spoke to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh, instead of releasing the people, made the work harder on the Israelites, and the Egyptians had rejected him. The Israelites had rejected Moses, and there we saw that Moses experienced God through his perseverance. And it was last week that I reminded you that when life presses in, press on. And so today we're going to experience the salvation that God offers to Moses, and the salvation that God offers to you and to me. So what happens here, just kind of bring you up to speed, that, Moses, he goes and he tells Pharaoh, hey, let my people go. And Pharaoh responds, no way, Moshe. And there Pharaoh actually says to Moses, he says, who is the Lord that I would listen to the Lord? And what happens after that is God answers Pharaoh's question. And he shows Pharaoh that he is the God of heaven, and he brings plagues upon the land of Egypt. And you know about them, how he turned the water into blood, and the gnats and the flies and the locusts and the frogs and the hail, and people got boils on their body, and the plague of darkness. There were 9 in all. And what happens after each of those plagues, instead of Pharaoh repenting and allowing the people to go, Pharaoh was relentless in his persecution of the Israelites. And it actually says, as those plagues happen in the land of Egypt, that Pharaoh's heart actually hardened, that he was more resistant. The more he experienced at the hands of God through these plagues, the less likely he was to let the people go. And then what happens after that is God is about ready to send one last plague upon the land of Egypt. And if you look in chapter 11, verse 1, it says this, now the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. God says, hey, he's not relented yet, but after this plague, he's not just going to let you go. Pharaoh is going to make you go. And he's not just going to make you go, but the Egyptians are actually going to pay you to go. Because in verse number 2, it says, tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. Like as you're leaving, ask them for their silver, ask them for their gold. They're going to give it to you just to get you out of the land. And what God says, and then what Moses says to the people, he begins to describe what this plague is going to be like, and it's going to be the death of the firstborn of every child in the land of Egypt. In verse 4 it says, so Moses said, this is what the Lord says, about midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the slave girl who's at her hand. handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well, that every firstborn in the entire land is going to die. Verse 6, there will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any man or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Now, it's probably not completely accurate to say that God made an exemption. God exempted the people of Israel from this last plague. It's probably more accurate to say that God provided an exemption and redemption for the people of Israel. And what they had to do was that they had to take this exemption that God was offering them, and they actually had to appropriate it to their lives. They had to step out in faith and do what God had asked them to do to experience the exemption that God was making available to them. And this exemption that God is giving to the people of Israel is such a critical exemption that God says, I actually want you to change your calendar as a result of what I'm going to do on this night. In chapter 12, verse 1, it says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. Moses, what I'm going to do here tonight is so profound that it's going to change your whole calendar. That when you leave here, it's going to be a new start. It's going to be a new beginning. You've been in bondage and slavery for so many years, but now freedom and redemption has come to you. And so it's almost like God is saying, here you can start over again. And what's going to happen here is he's saying every year when this day comes on the new year, it'll be a day in which you will celebrate, a day in which you will remember what I am going to do on this night. And this night is what is called Passover. And Passover just simply means it's the night in which God passed over the people of Israel. And so what I want you to see here first is God's direction for the Passover. If you look in verse number 4, God begins to give them directions. There's actually 3 directions that God gives them as they prepare for this Passover night. In chapter 12, verse 3, tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. The first step in the directions that God gives to Israel is to choose a lamb, find a lamb. And he says that the lamb can be taken from the sheep or the goats, but the lamb has to be 1 year old and it has to be without defect. When you choose the lamb, Moses, when they choose the lamb, it cannot have a crooked nose. It can't have any sores. It can't have any scabs. It can't have a chipped hoof. It has to have pure white wool. Because what God is requiring of the people here is a perfect sacrifice. So he tells them to find a lamb. And then the second thing he tells them to do is to take that lamb and to keep it for 4 days and then kill the lamb. He says in verse 6, take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Now he gives a very specific time here. You couldn't just kill the lamb anytime you wanted. It had to be done at twilight. And he tells them that they are to slaughter it. Like what happens here this night is not just the lamb was euthanized, but the lamb was slaughtered. What God was asking them to do was to take the lamb, hold it by the head, and take a sharp knife and slit its throat, and that blood would come out of the lamb onto the ground, and it would flow out of that lamb until the life bled out of that animal. And then what God tells them next, the third step here, is to apply the blood. He says in verse 7, then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. And so as that lamb's blood was flowing out, they probably had to take a bowl and catch the blood, but the blood did not stay in that bowl long. because then they had to go outside of their house to the front door and take blood and put it over the top and the sides of the door frame. And here what they were to do is they were to do this so that they would be protected from the plague that God was going to send upon them that night. And they were protected because they acted faithfully. In Hebrews 11:28, there it tells us that Moses, by faith, took the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorframe of his house. You see, that night in Egypt, every home was going to experience a death. The homes of the Egyptians, the unfaithful Egyptians, their homes, they were going to experience the death of a firstborn. The faithful people of Egypt, or of Israel, they were going to experience the death of a substitute. And I can just imagine that night in which all of this is happening, that the family has had this lamb in their house for 4 days. Maybe the kids grew attached to it, and dad takes it outside and slits its throat, and the kids may be crying out, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy, why are you doing this?" And it was there that their father would explain to them that this lamb was to die as a substitute. So that because of the death of the lamb, their firstborn did not have to die. And the power of what was happening that night would not have been lost on the firstborn of every one of those homes. They would have witnessed that lamb dying in their place as a substitute. And so what we have here is the direction of God's direction for the Passover. What we see next is Israel's protection in the Passover. I imagine that night as the sun is setting after they've applied the blood to the door frames of their houses, that they're all huddled together. They're eating the Passover meal together when they begin to hear the wails and the groans and the crying of the Egyptians around them. Because in chapter 11, verse 6, it says, God says there will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. However, they are in their homes knowing that they are safe because they have been covered by the blood. In chapter 12, verse 12, it tells us, "On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are." He says, as you sit in the house, as you look at the blood on your doorframe, it's to be a sign for you about the promise that I have made to you. And God goes on and he says, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." You see, that night, someone died in every home. And it's almost as if God had them sacrifice a lamb as a substitute. And when God saw the blood on the doorframe, that he knew that that house, judgment had been executed, and he passed over. And notice God's promise here. God promised his people. He did not promise, "When I see that you're an Israelite, I will pass over." His promise was not, "When I see that you've been bar mitzvahed, I will pass over." He did not say, "When I see that you're a member of the synagogue or the temple, then I will pass over." He didn't say, "When I see that you are just trying to be a good person, then I will pass over." No, God's promise was, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." You see, the fact that God passed over these people had nothing to do with their race, with their ethnicity, with their socioeconomic status. It had nothing to do with how good or how bad they were. It had nothing to do with anything that they could or could not do. It had to do with the fact, are they covered by the blood? Their protection that night was determined by the blood of the Lamb. And what we learn here from this passage of Scripture, the take-home truth that I want to give you today is this, is that When the blood of the Lamb is applied, sin and death are nullified. Here, when they applied the blood of the Lamb, they knew that sin and death would pass over them. When the blood of the Lamb is applied, sin and death are nullified. Now, this may be a great story. It made a great movie by Cecil B. DeMille. But what is the implication for you and I? What does this mean to you and I? And what I want to do here is I want to give you our connection to the Passover. If you look in verse 14, God says, "This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance." God says, what happened here tonight, you must never forget. Every year when this day comes around, you are to celebrate this day, and you're to remember the night in which I passed over you. However, what God, I think, is doing here is He's trying to get them to see that this is to point to something greater. This night was to point to something greater. This night was to show that one day there was going to be a better substitute. It was to show them that one day there was going to be a greater act of redemption that was going to take place. And almost a millennium later, or over a millennium later, John the Baptist is out in the wilderness. And there he is calling people to repent of their sins because the kingdom of God is at hand. He was baptizing people, calling people to repentance. And one day as he was out there in the wilderness, and the scriptures say that everybody from all the towns and villages, they came out to hear him. So everybody was standing around. And one day as he was out there preaching, he sees Jesus approaching. And then John says these words in John chapter 1, verse 29. He says, "Look." I imagine all the kids that are kind of a little rowdy, they're making some noise. He says, stop, I want you to look. All the people that might be talking back and forth, hey, just stop for a minute. I want you to look. I want you to pay attention to something. I want to call your attention to someone who's approaching. And he says, look, it's the Lamb of God. Now, that word that John used in the original language was a possessive noun. What he was saying there, he's saying, look, it's God's lamb. It's the lamb that belongs to God. It's here, God has sent us his lamb. And all the people that were standing around that day, their minds would have immediately gone to the celebration of Passover. I think they would have automatically thought about how year after year and generation after generation for the last 1,000+ years, how on that day they would sacrifice a lamb to commemorate the Passover. And here John is telling them, God's lamb has come. No longer do you have to find another lamb, because now the lamb that God has provided has stepped onto the scene. And he says, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The word that John uses there for take away means to lift up and carry away. He says, this Lamb of God who has come, he doesn't just cover over your sin. What he does, he lifts up and he carries it away. No longer do you have to be under the burden of sin any longer, because the Lamb of God has come who will lift up and carry away. No longer do you try to have to cover over your sin on your own, because the Lamb of God has come who will lift up and carry away. And the way in which John used that verb, it gave the idea of continuous action. So it was something that was going to happen today, happen tomorrow, happen the day after that, happen next year, happen even into the next hundreds and thousands of years, that he was always going to be the Lamb of God who would always lift up and carry away the sin of the world. And you fast forward to the end of Jesus' life. And the night in which the night before he was going to the cross to die on the cross, he brings his disciples together, and he actually says to them, he says, I've been looking forward to celebrating this Passover with you. It was Passover. They were going to celebrate Passover. And on that night, Jesus says to them, he says, take and eat this bread. And when you eat it, don't do it in remembrance of that lamb. Don't do it in remembrance of that night. thousands of years ago. Do it tonight and here on after in remembrance of me. Take this cup and drink from it. This is my blood in which the new covenant has been written, the new deal that God has given to us. Don't do it in remembrance of what happened there in Egypt thousands of years ago. From now on, I want you to do this in remembrance of me. The Apostle Peter, who was there that night as they were celebrating that, what we call the Last Supper, that last Passover that Jesus had with them. And as Peter thinks about what happened that night, Peter writes this in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Peter, as he thinks back on Jesus' life and death, he says, God provided a lamb for us. The perfect Lamb of God who died as my substitute and your substitute. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 5:7, there he actually says the words, he says, Christ is our Passover lamb who was sacrificed for us. And what they want us to remember is that Jesus came as the perfect Lamb of God to be the perfect substitute for you and for me. And now, because of our faith in Christ, God will pass over us because He is the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. So your connection to Passover is ultimately the coming and the death of Jesus Christ. Have you made a decision to be a Christ follower? It's as easy as A, B, C. First of all, you have to admit that you are a sinner. Admit that you've blown it. Stop trying to minimize, stop trying to justify, stop trying to ignore your sin, and just come clean with God. That you have failed to live up to the standard that He has given to you. And next is B, believe. Just believe that Jesus is who He said He is. Believe that Jesus died as your sacrificial substitute on the cross. And believe that He died and on the third day He rose again from the dead. And then C, commit. Commit your life to following Jesus. You see, it's not just enough to believe, but our belief should change our behavior. And what Jesus has called us to do throughout the pages of Scripture is to follow Him. And when we believe Him, we should want to follow Him. And so admit, believe, commit. Because when the blood of the Lamb is applied, sin and death are nullified. I just want you to imagine for a second. Imagine that you're standing there with Moses. And Moses gives us these instructions about what we're to do that night. That he tells us, hey, God's going to bring a plague. He's going to kill the firstborn in your house. But God has made a way of provision for you. All you need to do is take a lamb, slaughter it, and take the blood and apply it to your doorframe. And then He will pass over you. I think all of us would be willing to do that. Would you be willing to trust in Jesus? Would you be willing to follow Jesus? Because you and I have a sin problem that's going to lead to a crash and lead to death. But when the blood of the Lamb is applied, sin and death are nullified. 4 al-Qaeda terrorists walked into the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, Kenya on Saturday, September 21st, 2013. They just randomly opened gunfire in the food court of the mall that day. And having coffee with her friend was a young woman by the name of Sneha. And when the gunfire opened, she jumped down on the floor to try to evade the gunfire. And when she landed on the floor, she found a young man lying next to her who had been shot, and he was bleeding profusely. In a split second, Sneha decided to take that young man's blood and put it on her face and on her body. And the impromptu camouflage saved her. She just lied there motionless until help finally arrived. Later on, Sneha was interviewed about what happened that day, and she said this. She said, "I think that young man's blood protected me. It saved my life." I want to let you know today that when the blood of the Lamb is applied, sin and death are nullified. Jesus came to die for you. As I close here today, I just want to play a song by an artist named Charity Gale. She sings a song entitled, "Thank You, Jesus, for the Blood."
Was rich, I remember who I was. I was lost, I was blind, I was running out of time. Sin separated, the breach was far too wide. But from the far side of the chasm, you held me in your sight. So you made a way across the great divide, left behind heaven's throne to build it here inside. And there at the cross, you paid the debt I owe, broke my chains, freed my soul. For the first time I had hope. Thank you, Jesus, for the blood applied. Thank you, Jesus, it has washed me white. Thank you, Jesus, you have saved my life, brought me from the darkness into glorious light. You took my place, laid inside my tomb of sin. You were buried for 3 days, but then you walked right out again. And now death has no sting, and life has no end. For I have been transformed by the blood of the Lamb. Thank you, Jesus, for the blood applied. Thank you, Jesus. Jesus has to his name. There to my heart was the blood applied. Glory to his name.
When the blood of the Lamb is applied, sin and death are nullified. Father, thank you again for your sacrificial death as our substitute. God, I pray that if there are any who are watching who have never trusted you as their Savior, that today they would make that decision, that they would admit that they're a sinner, that they would believe in the death and the resurrection of Christ, and that today they would commit to following you. I pray for those of us as believers that as we think about this great message, that we would not be ashamed to share this message with those who need to hear it in our lives. And so I pray that you would just do your work in our lives for your glory and honor. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to see you soon.